can make it here to class this morning. We're going to pick up in Acts chapter 15, where we've been studying the last couple of weeks. See how much progress we make today. Now, you'll remember that this is the Jerusalem Council, for lack of a better term. I don't know that I like it, but it's as good as any, I guess. That they came together to decide how to handle a conflict that had arisen in the first century church. And this was a conflict over what, if any, of the Jewish customs do we need to carry over into Christianity. Go ahead, Lowell.
Wasn't Jerusalem Council what the Bible called it? I thought that was the wording that was used in the Bible.
Was it? Okay. I don't remember, but you find it and look it up for me if you would. Then I'll feel better about using it. That's the heading. Yeah. Yeah, that's the heading at the top of my chapter, but I didn't know if it was actually a scriptural reference or not. So anyway, they had debated this in Antioch. Now they're going to debate it in Jerusalem. In verse 7, Peter stood up and said to them, "Brothers, you're aware that in the early days God made a choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles would hear the gospel message and believe. And God, who knows the heart, testified to them by giving the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith." So here is the real crux of what Peter's going to say and why he said what he said to this point. He says, "Now then, why are you testing God?" Now that's a question we need to ask, isn't it? Why are we testing God? Why would they do this? And they were doing this by putting a yoke on the disciples' neck that neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear. Why in the world are we doing this? So I put in my notes, these are very important questions to consider. Why are you testing or tempting God? Why do you put yokes on them that God did not? Why are you burdening them with something that none of us could do correctly, and as in keeping the law? Why risk making him mad? I wish I had a good answer for that. Why do we risk making God mad by insisting on doing things that he doesn't care about, that makes no difference anymore? The Greek word for testing here, or tempt in the King James Version, is peirazo, to try whether a thing can be done. In a bad sense, to test one maliciously or craftily, to test one's faith, to solicit to sin. This 2D2 here, this is out of Thayer's. It says, men are said to tempt God by exhibitions of distrust. So did they trust God? Apparently not, did they? Apparently not. Had Jesus anywhere in his ministry, anywhere, said, you know, these Old Testament laws are pretty good. I want you to follow the ceremonial cleansings. I want you to worship on the Sabbath day. I want you to do all this stuff, the sacrifices. I want you to do all of that. There's not anywhere in the New Testament where Jesus said that. Not even an implication of you ought to be doing this. Instead, he taught mercy, peace, and love, didn't he? He taught doing the right thing, getting your hearts right. He taught all this other stuff instead of these outward acts. If they had trusted Jesus, if they had trusted God, then this wouldn't be a question. They would simply be obeying what they were told to do. When we place burdens on others that God did not place on them, we are in effect arguing with God, saying, God, you don't understand. They really need to be doing this. And we know it even if you don't recognize it. What you think? That's my opinion. Why do we burden people with things that God doesn't burden them with unless we think we know better than God? Go ahead, David.
In the back of my mind, it seems that somebody said, whether it was Jesus or whether it was one of the apostles, somebody said, if you keep the law perfect, keep it.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody can keep it perfect.
Nobody can keep it perfectly.
So it's a moot point if it's not doable.
Mm-hmm.
And
should be gone. So go ahead, Lowell.
Well, Paul's the one that made that phrase. He didn't use those specific words, but
Right.
that's basically what he said. And also, counsel is used only one time, and that's in the NIV, not in the King James.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. You know, we're going to see in a minute that there's a whole verse missing out of the NIV, the Holman Christian Standard, English Standard, American Standard, that there's a whole verse in the King James that isn't in a lot of the other translations. That's verse 34 if you want to look ahead. But anyway, so we need to be careful about what we bind on others. We need to be careful and make sure that we don't bind something on others that God has not bound on them. That's one of the great challenges of being up here teaching or preaching, is to make sure that I don't do something or say something that puts pressure on you that shouldn't be there, that God would not have to be in your life. If I put pressure on you, I want it to be for the right reason, because I'm going to feel the same pressure. So I want to make sure that we do the right thing and for the right way. Do you think maybe they would try to argue with God and change his mind? You know? They were sitting there arguing with the apostles. You know, they wouldn't get him to, but you wonder if maybe they were trying to do that. Maybe try to get him to say that the Gentiles should follow Jewish rules. Maybe get him to admit that he'd made a mistake. You know, that they really do need to do all that stuff. You know, they weren't really questioning whether they should be admitted to the church, which I think is interesting. They were questioning the conditions under which they were to be admitted. If they're going to be admitted to the church and be a Christian, then these people felt like they ought to follow the Old Testament law. So I mentioned down here, how well do people bear up under the yoke of the Mosaical law? God knew that humans couldn't bear up to the Old Testament law. The apostles knew people couldn't hold up to it. Why couldn't the Pharisees see that? Why couldn't these Judaizing teachers step back and say, you know, this is so much easier. Why are we doing this to ourselves? And I have no doubt that some of them probably did. Some of them probably were like a big sigh of relief once they understood and realized that they didn't have to do all that stuff anymore. Particularly the ones that have been converted to Christianity, their eyes should have been opened. They should have seen what a mess had been made of the Old Testament laws, but they failed to look at it objectively because they were too close to it. You ever failed to see the forest for the trees? Go ahead, David.
Could be that you heard the old saying, "Looks too good to be true," it probably is. I think that could be a reason they refused, but it couldn't be that simple. They had made it so complicated.
Right.
It was not possible for it to be that simple.
That could have been part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Could have been too good to be true, couldn't it? But they didn't look at it objectively. Sometimes we get too close to a discussion or a decision or a way of life, and we can't look at it objectively. So sometimes we need to have somebody come and kind of wake us up, shake us out of our doldrums, get us away from the status quo, and help us to see that God is gracious and merciful, to help us maybe see that we are wrong about something and need to change our ways. How good are we about admitting when we're wrong? I'm better than I used to be. I'll say that. That's not saying a whole lot. but I am better than I used to be about that. And I hope we get better with that as we come to a better understanding of God's will for our lives, of the heart that we're to have as Christians, of the people that he's calling us to be.
You're not pointing your finger at me, are you?
I would never point my finger at you. Never, ever. If I point one at you, there's three pointing back at me, so I would tend to remember that phrase quite a bit. I couldn't remember the last time I pointed at someone in anger or in an argument. I can't remember ever doing that. I don't know. Probably have, unless it would tell us if she was here. Yeah, Clinton.
Well, what you're talking about, though, we have a balancing act that we have to perform all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, we have to, things that are just tradition and they're not bound to us, or bound upon us, we can't bind those things on other people. But our society has encouraged us to accept things that are totally unacceptable.
Right. And there is a tremendous balancing act that we're going to talk about when we talk about stumbling blocks down here later in the chapter, where, how do you balance the needs of one group versus another group? How do you decide what you're going to do? And we do have that balancing act of, we need to correct people, but we need to love people. Can we do both at the same time? And the answer is yes. Parents do that every day. Parents love their kids, but parents correct their kids. While I may not be Lowell's parent, if I see him do something just crazy wrong, I'm going to go up and kick him in the shin and tell him to stop. Huh? Well, I'm not going to point a finger, no. I've had somebody try to break my finger more than once doing that, so I'm not going to do that anymore. But, we do have that balancing act of how do we best handle these things? How do we do what God would have us to do and still maintain that loving attitude of caring and compassion, but yet draw the line at we just can't do this. It just can't be done. And that's something that's just a case-by-case basis. I mean, you can't lay down a single example of it. But verse 11 says, on the contrary. Now, we need to understand this on the contrary here, right? Because he's just talked about, why are you testing God by putting a yoke on the disciple's neck that no one can bear? Why are you doing that? On the other side of that, we believe we are saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus in the same way they are. So the contrary side of that, the flip side of that, is the little concept called grace. Now, I'm not real... Go ahead, Lowell.
The Amplified Bible has something in parentheses in that verse. It says, the undeserved favor and mercy of the Lord.
Undeserved favor and mercy, yeah.
Yes.
Basically grace. We call grace unmerited favor, and I hate that phrase, to be honest with you. But that's what we tend to call it to simplify it. But when we think about grace, think about that. What does grace really mean to us? Now, I don't want this unmerited favor being parroted back to me. Okay, what does it mean with everything? Let's explain that a little better.
You got a chance to be where you want to be when you die.
Okay.
By the grace of God, because you don't deserve it.
Okay. So David said because that we can be where we want to be when we die because of the grace of God, because we don't deserve heaven. I mean, we don't deserve that. Who in here is good enough to deserve heaven? I mean, there's not a one of us. But grace impacts our lives in so many different ways, and I didn't really make notes about this. It's just off the cuff. But how does grace impact your life? If you've received the grace of God, if you understand that because God is being gracious to you, even though you're stupid and you do things you shouldn't be doing, how does that impact the way you treat others? When someone else is stupid and does things they shouldn't be doing. It impacts every aspect, doesn't it? It impacts every aspect of my life, and it impacts every aspect of your life. When family does something stupid, get themselves arrested or whatever, how do you deal with that? How would grace teach us to deal with that? If someone goes off the reservation and just goes completely crazy, deserts their family. How do you deal with stuff like that? How do you deal with the grace of God and showing His grace through our lives? So does that mean that you just say, yeah, do whatever you want to do, you're going to be fine, I'll forgive you no matter what? Or does our grace mimic God's in that we can't just be out here doing loony bin stuff? If we are seeking to follow God, and because He has saved us, we are changing our lives. We are becoming more forgiving. We're becoming more compassionate. We're becoming more obedient. We are doing what He tells us to do in Scripture. Does our grace mirror that? Well,
We're told to live like Jesus did and mimic His actions.
Right.
And the only time I can remember Him doing something that might have been out of line was when He went into the temple
and flipped the tables.
But He didn't do it against people.
Mm-hmm.
The things He did was to the tables and the stuff that they
So sometimes our demonstrating our love for someone will be giving them a good swift kick in the pants, right?
Well, that's kind of to the person, but yeah,
Yeah,
more or less.
sometimes, you know. I mentioned someone getting arrested earlier. Sometimes it means letting that person sit in jail a day or two and think about what they've done and think about ways maybe they can be better and do better. There are lots of different ways that we can approach the things that happen in our lives daily. We just have to make sure that they're influenced by the grace and mercy of God, and that we're. Go ahead.
Can you imagine how people would react to that today?
To what today?
If Jesus came in and cleared the temple, how people would react?
Yes, so
They would be offended beyond that.
they would be offended, wouldn't they, if Jesus were to come in today and clear a church building. I can think of church buildings I'd like to be cleared. And y'all probably can too. But what if he were to do that today? People would be greatly offended.
Well, I'm sure the leaders didn't like it,
Mm-mm.
but they certainly didn't react.
Sometimes that was the only way to get someone's attention, wasn't it? By doing something out of the ordinary. Clinton?
Well, I would disagree with that. I would say they actually did react, and the reaction was to crucify him.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back right there.
Could have been. That and some other instances too. I mean, it all just kind of piled up, and we saw when we were going through Matthew that this pressure was just building and building. The longer he lived and taught and did what he did, the more pressure there was on them to do something drastic. And yeah, that definitely played a role in it. There's no question.
Well, now, they were plotting to kill him even before that.
Oh yeah, they were plotting for a long time. But they just weren't mad enough to do something about it until later on in his ministry. Let's see, is there anything? Yeah, we're fine. So verse 12. Then the whole assembly fell silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul describing all the signs and wonders that God had done through them among the Gentiles. So can you imagine sitting here in this building and say Paul comes in and starts talking about everything that he'd done in spreading God's word throughout the region of Cyprus and Antioch and Cilicia and all those places, about the number of souls that have been saved, about the good that have been done. You could have heard a pin drop because of the impact of that message. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, up until this time, God had rejected the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
They had not been his chosen
Yeah.
people, and the Israelites were real proud of that. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that was a boasting thing for them.
Well, sure.
So to see that God was accepting people that he had rejected in the past, or that he had led the people of Israel against in the past, that had to be quite an eye-opener for them.
It did, didn't it? And it was a situation where they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing and hearing, I don't think. Larry, go ahead.
Do we know how long it was since before this when Peter went to Cornelius' family? How many years has it been up to this time?
The commentators say that's about 10. Now, exactly how they come up with that number.
Pretty much about what happened to Cornelius.
Mhm. Yeah. And they actually had known long enough for them to forget. Because how well do you remember things that happened 10 years ago? I mean, I sure don't. But, they had to, this was such a dramatic change for the Jews particularly, because they had been used to being the chosen people and no one else was as good as them in their own mind. And then it was also a tremendous change for the Gentiles in saying, we've been dogs for so long, but now we're equals. How does that happen? It comes from both sides. Both sides one side has an inferiority complex, one side has a superiority complex. Now they're having to meet in the middle. And that's going to create some problems. Clinton?
Well, there was a proselytization process, and so the Jews unnecessarily treated people as second-class human beings.
Mm-hmm.
That, I don't believe, was ever God's will.
No, I don't think it was his will at all. And that's proven by what Jesus did when he came. Yeah.
Like Rahab the prostitute,
Mm-hmm.
she was a Gentile,
Yep.
and she is part of the lineage of David.
Right.
Part of the lineage of Christ.
Mm-hmm. you, Lowell, or David?
That hypocrisy to me of they married foreigners, they married Gentiles for years and years. And yet, now all of a sudden when they're made to be equal under Christ, they can't stand it.
Right. Right. Because it's invading their space. You know, they have this safe little space where they're God's chosen people, and they don't want anyone else coming into that sphere. You know, and I can see, because of centuries of belief like this, how it would be hard. It would be tough to let it go. But under the teachings of Jesus, we know that we have to let it go. That it's got to be changed. And that Gentiles are now welcome, and they're on equal terms with them. Now, it's interesting to me that we have Peter up here speaking in verses 7, 8, 9, and 10 and 11. And then Barnabas and Paul get up and talk, and then we're going to see James get up and talk. Now, if Peter was really the first pope, and I guess I'm going there. If Peter really was the first pope, why did anyone else need to talk? Okay, and y'all are all shaking your head. You're like, he wasn't the first pope, and no, he wasn't. And that's why I wanted to bring this up here, is because this is a clear example of Peter not being the head of the church on earth. I mean, this is very clear and plain here that he is one of many, that he is not up here above Paul, he's not up here above Barnabas. They're equals together. Well,
we read constantly about Peter's mistakes that he made.
Peter made a few mistakes, didn't he? So did Paul. So did Barnabas.
Apparently he was a little more out of line from time to time than the rest of the apostles.
Yeah. We're going to see.
He didn't repent of it.
Right. Yeah. We're going to see an instance here at the end of this chapter where Paul and Barnabas are out of line. And we'll talk about that when we get down to the end of the chapter. But we all make mistakes. Everyone does. And I'm glad that God doesn't deal with our mistakes the way we deal with each other's mistakes. I'm glad that he is more merciful and gracious than what I can be sometimes. And that my parents could be sometimes. And that we can be to each other. Because we need that mercy and we need that grace. Because we will mess up. We will make mistakes. So we need that grace that was mentioned in verse 11. Now in verse 12, the whole assembly fell silent, listened to Paul and Barnabas describe their travels and the wonders that were done and the number of people that was saved. I don't know how long it took them to recite all that, but my imagination tells me it was a while, that they really had to speak for a while. And then verse 13, after they stopped speaking, James responded, "Brothers, listen to me." So this is James. This is James the Just, James the Less, the author of the epistle. Let's see. Apparently he came to prominence in the Jerusalem church after the death of James, the brother of Christ, or James the brother of John, I mean. He's going to remind them what extraordinary lengths that God had to go to convince Peter to go to Cornelius and the Gentiles. Okay? So what extraordinary lengths did God go through to convince Peter that he really needed to do this? You remember that vision of stuff coming down out of heaven and the fact that God had to tell Peter not once, not twice, but 3 times, it's okay. None of this is unclean. Kill and eat. He had to tell him 3 times in one vision that it was okay. God worked really hard to get the Gentiles into the fold. Simon has reported in verse 14 how God first intervened to take from the Gentiles a people for his name. And the words of the prophets agree with this, as it is written, "After these things I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. I will rebuild its ruins and set it up again, so the rest of humanity may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does these things, known from long ago." You want to know where that quote's from? I didn't until I looked it up. Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 is where this comes from. It's not a direct word for word quote. It says, "In that day I will restore the fallen booth of David. I will repair its gaps, restore its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that are called by my name." This is the Lord's declaration. He will do this. He will do this. And I wrote down 3 other places where the same thing is prophesied about in the Old Testament. So this has been God's plan from creation, right? God has always planned for the gospel to be available to all people, without limitation, without hesitation, to every person on the planet. So this is why we do what we do, isn't it? With our missionary works that we support, with people that go on missionary trips, because God wants every person on the earth to hear. He wants every person on the earth to believe. He wants every person on the earth to be saved. And so this is our calling today, and why we do what we do. We do this because we care. We do this because we love people. We do this because God has asked us to. And it's what we're supposed to do.
So how did the Old Testament prophets get by the thing? I forgot that before you brought it up. How did they get by with it without being chastised severely?
I don't know. I don't know that they weren't chastised. I don't, because we just don't have record of it.
What do you ask?
How did the Old Testament prophets get away with talking about the Gentiles this way? And honestly, too, they probably just chalked it up to him being an old kook and not anything to worry about.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it got to the point they killed him, so
Right.
obviously they didn't have a whole lot of respect for God's messenger.
Right. That's so.
Same thing with Revere, Isaiah.
Mm,
It was in Isaiah
it was in Isaiah also,
also.
yeah.
They think Revere again.
And if you think about reading stuff from different writers, sometimes you just glance over things and it doesn't really impact you. You don't really pay attention to what it's talking about. That happened to me. Where was it? Yeah, in verse 24. Because it talks about, in the King James, subverting your heart or subverting your soul. I hadn't paid any attention to that phrase, subvert your soul. We're going to talk about that when we get down there to verse 24 here in the next week or two. Because that act of subverting a person's soul, that's bad news. And that's something we need to consider when we get there. But that was one of those passages that, I'd read over it 100 different times. It never really made any impact on me until this morning when I looked at that. And I don't doubt that's probably what happened with some of the Old Testament prophets too. You sit up here and you listen to me talk for 35, 40 minutes on a Sunday morning. How well do you remember something I say in the middle of class? Unless I just say something mighty crazy or tremendously impactful by accident, you're not going to remember word 3042 through 3054 of what I said. And I don't doubt that that's what happened with some of the Old Testament prophets as well.
Well, a lot of times they didn't like the prophets. They didn't like what the prophet was telling them because
Yeah.
it was condemning them. And they were determined to do just the opposite.
Right.
They were still, a lot of the time, worshiping false idols.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
like David said, they were marrying the Gentiles. Well, that was against God's will.
Well,
God
sure it
told
was.
them, don't do that.
Yeah, he told them not to do that. And so there are things that are easier for us to hear, I think, or that we will accept more readily. In terms of, I know I'm not supposed to be marrying a Gentile. I know I'm supposed to be keeping this commandment. I'm supposed to be following this and doing this sacrifice at this time and washing my hands a certain way. I know I'm supposed to be doing all this stuff. I can accept that. I can't accept the fact that the Gentiles are coming in, so I'm going to let that go in one ear and out the other. Sometimes it's stuff that we're not ready to hear. Let's see. Verse 19. Therefore, in my judgment, we should not cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to God. How big a statement is that? Therefore, in my judgment, we should not cause difficulties for those that would turn to God. That's a pretty big idea, isn't it? We don't need to make their lives any more difficult than what they already are. We need to work with them as God would have us to work with them. James sums up the arguments, makes known the decision. The decision is to not make things difficult for the Gentiles. The stumbling block of circumcision and many other things will be removed. However, a few carryover things will be in place. So let's continue that sentence. We should not make or cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to God, but instead, we should write a letter to them about doing 4 things. Okay? Number 1 is to abstain from things polluted by idols. Why would we choose that one? Idol worship was rampant among the Gentiles. We read about it all throughout the Old Testament, don't we? All kinds of gods and statues and things that were worshipped. But they're commanded to abstain from things polluted by idols because that's always been a commandment of God. Abstain from idols. All the way back to the 10 Commandments. Don't make an idol, don't worship an idol. Number 2, abstain from sexual immorality. Now this is interesting because this is not a ceremonial commandment, this is a moral commandment. But abstain from sexual immorality. Now, what do you know about idol worship in that day? Melissa just texted me and said I never pointed a finger at her, so I guess she's watching. She's at her mom's house and watching, so. But anyway,
Good to know.
yeah.
I thought that would be very obvious, but you still got all your.
Yeah, I've still got all my fingers, so it's pretty obvious, isn't it? But anyway, 4 things, and we'll talk about these more next week when we have more time. But abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from eating anything that's been strangled, and from blood. All right, so these 4 things we're going to go ahead and say you don't need to be doing this stuff. But what isn't included in this list? There's not a single ceremony or feast commanded in the Old Testament that's carried over. There's not any of the hand-washing ceremonies, any of the purification ceremonies. None of that stuff is carried over. Circumcision is not carried over. They're losing almost all of their Old Testament teachings. Just about every one of them. And their superiority. You know, so think about this in terms of how we would react if that kind of change was thrown on us all of a sudden. And, you know, see if maybe we would react the same way the Jews did or not. But we've got these 4 things here that are going to be carried over. And verse 21 tells us, for since ancient times, Moses has had those who proclaim him in every city, and every Sabbath day he is read aloud in the synagogues. So these 4 things, because it's been done from ancient times, and this is a compromise, isn't it? And we need to talk about this next week when we gather again. This is a compromise to keep peace among the 2 parts of the church. We're going to learn some things from this example here of how we handle church conflict. How do we decide what to do when conflict arises? Because it's natural in a congregation of people. It doesn't have to be a big one. You know, a family of 5 can fuss and fight. It doesn't take a lot of people. So we'll talk about that some more next week. Thank you for